as well. And you've only got to look at what's happening with people trying to develop carbon prices for, to deal with things like global warming to understand that it's incredibly economically tricky and detailed and complicated to get right. But it is a kind of language which therefore means you can talk to the whole world rather than just to one slice of it. It's very powerful indeed.
Well, let's talk to the whole world through Ngaire Woods, who's here. You're an economist and look specifically at global governments. Are you convinced that natural capital, this idea, can make an impact?
Yeah, so I am interested in how you move from the kinds of arguments that Tony's making to how you actually govern them. So, I'm Dean of a School of Government at Oxford University. We're interested in what does it mean for government. And I'll never eat an oyster again, Tony, thanks to you. Learning from
There's quite a lot of things you may not do again after readings, but there's also some things that you
But I
would
learnt
do.
from Tony's book that one modest little oyster filters 200 litres of water a day. And there's great power in his explanation to us about how the natural world has these management and coping mechanisms that we often ignore. And I think actually that the descriptions do better than the numbers. I think the numbers help grab attention. But, it was like reading William's essay on the ash tree. I'll never look at an ash tree again that way because what that writing does is inspire you and set a goal. But then the question is, I think there's a tendency for people to say, well, because these are all interconnected problems and global, we need global rules, or we need central government to act. And that's where I would pose some big questions. There was a wonderful political economist, Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize last year. And her work was dedicated to looking at how, in practice, do we manage these things? How do we manage oyster beds? How do we manage ecological systems? And one of the powerful lessons in her work is that it's got to be local. You've got to go to a local community. Often it's local communities that know about these protective qualities and that want to protect them. And it's there in a local community with the whole community participating that you can start to create rules and enforcement, and that we should only look to central and global government when we need backup parameters.
But can I just ask you on central government, is there any evidence that these big figures that are being bandied about now in this argument, X billion being put down to whether you have, keep your vulture population alive or not, do these figures make any difference if people can't see where the cost falls?
Well, I think so. On the one hand, I think they are, as was said before, they sit among lots of figures. So the government that's looking at the cost of vultures dying in India is also looking at the profits of Novartis, the company that produced the drug, the tax revenue that might accrue from that, the benefits to the farmers from healthier cows, as you mentioned. There are a lot of dazzling figures there. The important thing about ecologists coming up with figures is that it helps governments conduct a wider cost-benefit analysis. But the note of scepticism I would sound is an assumption that governments around the world proceed on the basis of evidence. And John could talk to this, but actually, although it's really important to have evidence, and as a researcher that's key to my own belief system, governments just as often proceed by anecdote. So the stories, the inspiration, those anecdotes are actually really important to the business of government as well.
I should say, Tony, that there are not only negative or scary examples in your book. You discuss in detail at Costa Rica where the rush for resources and growth potential hasn't entirely trumped the environment argument.
No. And so that's the other job I try to do in What Has Nature Ever Done for Us is to explore some of the things that are already being done to show that it is actually possible to convert an understanding of the ecological value of economics into practical things that countries, companies and communities can actually do. And you mentioned the example of Costa Rica. I think that's a very powerful example because that country during the late 1970s was rapidly deforesting. Not least to make way for cattle ranches to feed the North American demand for beef for the fast food industry. And the country became concerned that this was going to cause damage to its economic base, and over a period began to develop metrics based on, for example, tourism revenues and also the water that the forests were capturing, which were powering hydroelectric dams, which were basically the country's principal power source. More recently, carbon has been added to the list of values there. And that country, between now and the late 1980s, has not only doubled its forest cover, it's also doubled its per capita GDP, showing that there isn't necessarily a trade-off between improving people's lives, welfare and their comfort, whilst at the same time not only conserving ecological systems, but in that case actually improving them. So it can be done, and there's plenty of examples from different parts of the world, some on a small scale, some on a larger scale, but I think that the proof is there, and I do try to put that across in order to inspire people to see that it's not simply a theoretical argument about numbers. It actually does lead to real-world opportunities.
Larry, you've looked at sustainability in a global context, but also how the approach that governments now take to it. Tony's view seems to be that the environment must be at the centre of things. He's interpreted it variously and come up with a new way of doing so in the book. But would you agree that sustainability can really be at the heart of what modern governments do? Or is that a little bit of wishful thinking from the Greens, whether they're of an older generation or the modernisers in the Green movement today?
Well, I think the big conflict about it that I see at the global level concerns industrialised countries who realise that poorer countries wanting to industrialise are finding that the cheapest way to do that is the most environmentally unfriendly. Burn tons of coal, industrialise quickly, get economic growth. And so the industrialised countries are trying to tell poorer countries, you must not do that, because that will create climate change that will adversely affect us all. And poorer countries and emerging economies are coming back and saying, who are you to tell us how to develop? You've burnt all your coal and you are continuing to do so. So you have no grounds to tell poorer countries that they can't do this to develop. And the next stage of the debate is then, OK, then we will pay you to use cleaner energy, which is economically rational. We should pay poorer countries to mitigate climate change that sometimes political factors stop us doing. The problem in global negotiations is that having opened that debate, industrialised countries have very quickly backpedaled out of it. Yeah. And the money they're willing to put on the table is tiny. So in the end, what poorer countries and emerging economies are facing are conditions being set by industrialised countries who are not themselves doing clean energy, but are finding that the United States and Europe are telling them that they must only use clean means and that they must pay the additional cost. And if you're the government of a small, very poor country, you can't afford that.
John Penrose.
I completely agree with that. I think that is a really good summary of where the debate is at the moment. And an awful lot of it can only be cleaned up by this notion of getting genuinely objective information and facts about what the costs of this stuff are. And part of the trouble is that everybody, policymakers and everybody else, who, even if they're trying to take a rational choice, an evidence-based choice, rather than just something which is based on anecdote, people feel like they're groping in the dark because an awful lot of these numbers either aren't available at all, or people are only just starting to understand what the costs of doing X will be. And therefore, there's all sorts of unintended consequences, some of which only happen, you only notice 20, 30, 40 years after you've taken a particular course of action. And therefore, this is still quite new science. It's certainly quite new public policy making in terms of the way that we as a race, planet-wide, think. And therefore, we aren't very good at this yet because we just don't have the information in front of us.
And what about the politics of it? Because the difference between you and the other people around the table is you have to go out and get elected, re-elected.
For my sins, yes.
For your sins and your party's sins. Yeah. So you do have this problem that it's easy for people, public policy makers or environmentalists, to tell politicians maybe what would be a very good thing to do. But it's difficult, isn't it, for governments to make the case for long-term plans when even in our own country, families are suffering now and they want reassurance and kind of insurance that things are not going to get more difficult for them.
But you're right that in a time of austerity, people tend to get quite reductive. They tend to think that some things are fripperies and nice to haves rather than essentials. And I think Tony's absolutely right to say, no, just some things are long-term essentials as opposed to immediate essentials. You can't ignore this stuff. So you're absolutely right. Those are short-term pressures. They'll be with us for as long as the austerity regime is with us here. But none